Hello, everybody, and welcome to our June session of our Tory Talks lecture series. My name is Jordan Hoffman. I'm the programming chair for Tory, and I'm happy to have you all here. Today we're going to continue this line of talks we've been having this year. We've had some really nice talks, and we're going to keep that great experience going with today's guest speaker, Dr. Mark Abrams. So Dr. Abrams attended SUNY Binghamton for his bachelor's and then received both his master's and PhD from Michigan State University. And today, Dr. Abrams is a professor of forest ecology and physiology at Penn State, where he's been faculty for, I believe, around 30 years. Is that accurate?
35 years.
35 years. Man, 35 years. In that time, Dr. Abrams has conducted and published a considerable amount of research with a diversity of different master's and doctoral students over the years, and particularly focused that research on the ecology, disturbance, and management of forests across the East Coast and Midwest. And so today he's going to be talking about some of his most recent work, and particularly on the I love the title of this presentation, by the way, Native Americans, Smokey the Bear, and the Rise and Fall of Oak Pine Forests in the Eastern U.S. So with that, Mark, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks again to the organizers of this seminar for the invitation, including my former PhD student, Carolyn Copenhaver, which many of you probably know is the editor of Tory right now and organized that special issue on Eastern oak forests. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is actually summarized in the main article that I had in that issue, although I actually had two. I'll talk about both papers, but the lead paper summarizes a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this talk. And what I've studied in my career mainly is forest dynamics or forest change, which has been a very important scientific topic of study in ecology almost from the beginning, and it remains very much so today. That's because forests are always changing, and there's a lot of debate about what the main drivers of that change is or are, and I'll be talking about that today. But some of the reasons that forests do change over time is forest succession, in which you have a disturbed area and early successional species like oak and pine come in, and then if left undisturbed, will change to middle successional species and then later successional species. However, during the course of that successional sequence, which might last 200, 300, 400, 500 years, very likely disturbances will take place, and that can be natural disturbance or human-caused disturbance. And also a lot of forest health issues. We have a lot of exotic insect and disease problems, but of course a very important driver, and we all know that climate is changing quite dramatically, although I will talk about that. The Eastern US is quite unusual in that respect. But climate change is also a driver of forest change. And scientists have very strong opinions about which is more important. And this is the very old climate land use or climate disturbance debate. And this pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. And right now we are in a time where climate change is dominating the thinking of science, but we should not forget that disturbances also exist and may still be having a very profound effect on our forests. Now, one thing that I've been interested in is the occupation of Native Americans of the United States, going back 14,000 years, let's say. And, the Native Americans, numbered into the millions and inhabited most of the US, and certainly that's true for the Eastern US. And there's a very good evidence that indigenous burning was the dominant factor for at least the last 5,000 years, and probably going back farther than that. And I will make the argument that I think that this indigenous burning was an even more important factor than climate or climate change was over that time. So my research has investigated major changes in forests, the rise and fall of species, and the drivers of that change in the eastern US before and after European settlement. And what I'll be doing in my talk today is talking about indigenous people as ecological managers, using fire, using agriculture and land use, and all this had a dramatic impact on vegetation. What happened to the fire cycle and land use after European settlement? How did our forest composition change, particularly after the Smokey the Bear era starting in the 1930s, examining climate and land use as drivers of forest change to try to figure out which one is more important in the eastern US. And then I'll be talking about some of our current threats to sustaining our dominant native tree species, including problems with deer, and then some of the forest management stuff that I have been getting into. And then, as I said, much of this has been summarized in a very recent paper I did with Greg Nowacki and Bryce Hanbury that was just published in the last month or so in the most recent issue of Tory. And I've, throughout my career, I've been able to study most of forests in most of the eastern US. And we can see that there's a very strong temperature gradient going from north to south, where we go from subboreal to northern hardwood to mixed oak, oak hickory, getting into oak pine down south, and then finally getting into the southern pines. And we can see that this very much follows a temperature gradient, but also a fire gradient historically, with more fire occurring down south than would happen up north. That's not to say we didn't have fires up north, but I'll be showing some information that there was quite a bit more burning down south that promoted these oak and pine forests. So we have to keep in mind that even though there is this very strong temperature gradient, there's a lot of disturbances that have been going on in each one of these forest types, in each one of these bands. It's not just temperature control, there's a lot of disturbance aspects to their distribution. So how I got started in this subject, going back to 1983, is after I got my PhD at Michigan State University. The country was in a recession. I actually had quite a bit of trouble trying to find a job. It was really hard to get a job as an ecologist in academia at the time. So I took a postdoc position at Konza Prairie, which is actually in eastern Kansas. So mainly prairie here, but there are gallery forests, these thin bands of oak-dominated forests that exist in these ravines in the prairie interior. And this prairie was managed with fire every couple years. But when I wasn't doing my work in the prairie, I went into these oak-dominated gallery forests. And you can see that this was a long time ago and how much aging has gone on during that time. But I started studying the overstory and understory of these gallery forests that were dominated by oak. And one of the things that I found really curious is that oak was dominating in the overstory, but there was very little oak in the understory, which was dominated by later successional shade-tolerant type of species. And from that, I came up with probably the most important idea of my career, which has been called the fire and oak hypothesis. And what I hypothesized at that time is that periodic burning of these oak forests, mainly by Native Americans, helped sustain the prairie, the tallgrass prairie, and helped sustain the oak forest. But when fire was excluded from these oak forests after the Smokey the Bear era, these became more closed forests, less light in the forest understory. The oaks had trouble regenerating, and the later successional shade-tolerant species started to take over, meaning that periodic fire was needed to maintain oak dominance in these forests. And one resource that I've relied on heavily in my career that we're very lucky to have is that soon after European settlement of the United States, the government basically ordered a survey of the physical resources, the forest resources that we had, let's say during the 1700s and 1800s. And the trees that were surveyed, these early survey trees, are called witness trees. And you can actually go online and download a lot of this data now, coupled with the Forest Service forest inventory analysis, giving you the modern comparison. So you can make these comparisons of forest change over, let's say, 200 or 300 years by comparing these witness trees to the contemporary forest surveys. And I've also, although I've done some fire history work myself, and I will be talking about this today, there was a really tremendous group in Missouri, Richard Guyette and more recently Mike Stambaugh, who have published, who basically have collected a tremendous amount of fire history data throughout the eastern US. And from that, we have a very good idea of what the burning cycles were like prior to European settlement. Really, and a surprising amount of burning going on up north, New England getting kind of cold and wet, so not so much, a really respectable amount up in the lake states, and a lot of burning going on in the oak-dominated central hardwoods, oak pine, pine-dominated forests. Really with some, maybe regimes of about every 5 to 10 years up here, and regimes of 2 or 3 years of fire return interval down here. So from these data, we can see that there was a tremendous amount of burning going on in the eastern US prior to European settlement. And what is very strange about that is how mesic the eastern US is. And actually, a lot of the precipitation is in this south central region with a very, very high fire frequency. So we have to get to the bottom of this little paradox that we have this mesic half of the eastern US and so much burning going on. Now, climate is important for burning, and we all know or can reason that hot and dry conditions promote fire, but a fire does not occur by itself. It needs an ignition source. And that would basically be from lightning, but we need a special kind of lightning to occur, and that's called dry lightning. Lightning strikes without the rainfall going on, because if it's raining really hard and there's lightning, that's not really going to cause a fire. So you need this dry lightning. As it turns out, dry lightning is important in Florida and along the Gulf Coast. But as we go farther north and actually out west, we get less and less lightning and less of this special type of dry lightning. So it's very hard to reason that these tremendous fire regimes were really because of dry lightning. It seems like something else was going on. And it's also important to point out that even now, 90% of the Western wildfires are caused by humans, because you can see the big decline in lightning strikes as you go farther west. So if dry lightning caused fires were not that extensive, what was the ignition source for these fires prior to European settlement? And the answer seems to be the Native Americans, the human fire hypothesis. And a lot of reasons why Native Americans were using fire. So just to list some of these, and the list is actually quite long. And many of these are summarized in this paper that I just keep referring to here, like hunting and driving of game animals, crop and forest management, creating and preserving agricultural fields. So the Native Americans over thousands of years had figured all of this out, how to use fire as a management tool, getting rid of unwanted tree species, promoting desirable species, grasses, shrubs, and oak pine, fireproofing areas, pest management, warfare, signaling, clearing areas for travel, keeping open forests so oak and pine can regenerate, felling trees, clearing lands. And all the evidence is that the Native Americans were very good fire managers. However, from that long list, the idea that really I found most fascinating, and in fact, Greg Nowacki and I wrote a review paper on this in 1998, was the relationship of using fire to the Native American diet. And we reasoned by doing literature review that when you burn under oak and hickory and chestnut, you get more mast or nut production. When you burn prairies, you get more forage and grain production. When you burn blueberry fields, you get more blueberry production. And not only were the Native Americans eating these food sources directly, but the animals that they wanted to hunt would also eat these food resources. So the Native Americans were actually promoting not only their own diet, but promoting the diet of the animals that they wanted to hunt as another food resource for themselves. So we summarized all that in a review paper we wrote in 2008. So once again, the Eastern US is dominated by a broadleaf, mesic type of forests that are not really conducive to burning, particularly during the summertime. So it would take a human effort putting fire on the ground and putting it at the right time, particularly during the spring and then in the fall, to explain why there was so much burning in the East. And now when we do burning, we mimic these type of practices by using drip torches and burning in the springtime or in the fall and getting these low to moderate intensity surface fires going on in oak and pine forests. And as I said, Native American populations numbered into the millions in 1942. And we actually have some information on the distribution and density of Native American populations. And what's interesting to me is that fairly high numbers up north, that again, is not that conducive to burning, particularly in the New England area, upstate New York. Sorry to admit that person. And so there seems to be a very good relationship between Native American population density and where the fires were occurring, and basically explaining the reasonably high fire frequency up north. So I live in Pennsylvania, so these were the native tribes that were fully occupying Pennsylvania. Many of you are probably in New York, so this is a map of the Native American, the main tribes that were covering all of New York and probably doing a lot of this burning that I'm referring to. So an important question is, did Native Americans really have the capability of altering forests and promoting oak and pine? So when I first started in Pennsylvania and looking at forest distributions and witness trees and so forth, one thing that we documented that I thought was really interesting is that the northern tier of Pennsylvania should be dominated by northern hardwood, white pine, and hemlock. But I noticed that there were fingers of oak and hickory and chestnut forests that stretched into this northern forest that we wanted to investigate. And what we found out in this study by looking at where the Native American villages were and where the trails were, where the Native Americans were, there was high numbers of walnut, which would have been a good tree to plant, not only for its wood, but of course the walnut nut itself, but also red oak, white oak, chestnut, hickory, black oak. So where there was a high Native American index, meaning towns and villages, agricultural fields and trails, there was a high dominance of these types here that I just listed, and then a lower amount of the typical species in the northern forests of the sugar maple, beech, and hemlock, and so forth. So it seemed very much that in northern forest, the Native American activity were promoting this oak, hickory, walnut type of mix. And another question that I was interested in, because a lot of the northern forests grow on poor soils because of the glacial outwash. And I started to read articles about the indigenous people in the Amazon that had very old and nutrient poor soils, actually doing things called terra preta down there, man-made black earth type soils, doing things to actually improve these soils to make them more suitable for agriculture by adding animal waste, crop residue, burning them, charcoal, burning the vegetation to enhance soil fertility and crop productivity. So I was interested in if this type of phenomenon was also going on in the northern part of the eastern US. So I had a project at Fort Drum, which is a military base in New York. I'll talk a little bit more about my involvement with these military projects and the amount of burning. But they had preserved a Native American old field village site at Fort Drum. And I was very interested to learn that it was still dominated by Chenopodium, a lamb's quarter, which was a species that might have been promoted and probably used by Native Americans. And even though the seeds are tiny, it's very prolific in seed production, and these seeds were ground into flour and used by Native Americans. And so we took control soils, which were the typical glacial outwash, really horrible, sandy, very dry, nutrient poor type of soils. And we collected soil samples from that Native American agricultural field that was preserved versus the control. And not surprisingly, this black earth soil at Fort Drum had much higher nutrient than the control soil. So that probably was something that the Native Americans were doing to, and this was the same soil texture, same origin, all of that. But the one on the agricultural field, we believe, was improved by Native Americans promoting higher nutrients and more productivity. Now, one other thing that I've done in my career, at least I have 2 or 3 studies on this, nothing like what Richard Guyette and Mike Stambaugh are doing, because they've dedicated their entire career to doing fire history. But I had one really good opportunity at Savage Mountain in Maryland, which is a 400-year-old old growth forest. Acknowledge my co-authors, Derlin Shumway and Charles Ruffner here. Charles is actually a co-author on one of my papers in the most recent Tory issue, standing next to a really beautiful red oak at Savage Mountain. But we found out that by mistake, they started logging this old growth forest until some groups or whatever actually put a stop to it. But it gave us a history to actually survey the remaining old growth that were not cut, but then go back and look at the fire history on the cut stumps, and I'll get to that in a second. We also collected witness tree information, which was the only study from Western Maryland. It seems to be kind of a black hole for these witness tree studies. But prior to European settlement, let's say in the 1700s, this area, Savage Mountain was dominated by white oak, hickory, black oak, chestnut, chestnut oak, chestnut, and oak. Really good mix of fire-adapted type of species. But when we surveyed this forest in 2000, the dominant is now red maple, which was not even part of the witness tree information. Chestnut oak is hanging on, white oak's hanging on, big increase in black birch. We lost our hickory component. We lost the chestnut component. Red oak is still hanging on, and this information is summarized in that second paper, again in this most recent Tory article. But anyway, so there's been a dramatic change going on in this forest. So we were able to recut these stumps, take them back to my lab, sand them down, and look at the fire history, look at these fire scars, which you can actually see as a disruption kind of, or a scar in the growth. That these fires were not intense enough to outright kill the tree, but damage a part of the cambium. And then the cambium would regrow, the tree would start growing, and the next fire would come along, more damage, recover from that, then another fire, and so forth, until Smokey the Bear started to kick in the 1930s and 40s, and then no more fires after this. So this was a real rare opportunity to get fire history in the East dating back 400 years. And what we can see from about 1600 to about the 1900, there was a fire return interval of about every 8 years in this forest. But then after Smokey the Bear, many fewer trees were getting scarred, and then a total cessation in burning after about 1960. And then we can couple this with the age distribution in this forest. And what we can see during this period from 1600 to the early 1900s, there was continuous oak and hickory recruitment. But then the chestnut blight kicked in. We lost our chestnut. This and the lack of burning going on caused a major recruitment period for the red maple and black birch. So when fire stopped, there was a conversion in this forest from oak and hickory reproduction to maple and black birch production, which is probably in the future going to take over this forest if the oaks cannot find a way to keep reproducing. So this picture is actually from a different old growth forest, but it's a very good example of what we see in a lot of our old growth. We have these beautiful legacy trees. This happens to be a white oak, but totally surrounded by beech and birch and red maple and blackum and so forth. So eventually this tree will die off and then be replaced by these later successional and mesophytic type species. So we are in this process of losing a lot of our eastern oak and pine forests because of the lack of fire. But an important question, is there evidence we can find today for fire in oak? I keep talking about the lack of burning in the oak, but luckily about 20 years ago, I was able to get my foot in the door with DOD and started getting a bunch of projects working on military bases because of their vast land holdings that they needed to learn about and learn how to manage to preserve native species and so forth. But when I got there, I found out because of all the exploding ordinances and the training going on, coupled with prescribed burning, the military bases in the East have some of the highest fire frequencies that we have anywhere. And so this is just one study that I did in Pennsylvania showing a recent burning during the 70s and 80s going into the 90s. And in these type of stands that have a lot of burning, you basically just have your oak and hickory component. You do not have that red maple, birch, beech, hemlock thing going on. So when we have frequent fire, we're able to maintain dominance by oak and hickory and pine species as pictured here. These are the overstory oak, but in this case, this being on a military base with a lot of burning, all of this understory and subcanopy is actually oak regeneration. This forest is open enough, it's getting enough fire, there's a lot of evidence of soil, charcoal, a lot of light getting there, and the oak is just very happy in that situation and doing a very good job of regenerating. And this fire is also keeping out that red maple birch component that I referred to. But there was another big land use thing going on in the East, not only the recent suppression of fire, but basically almost a total clear cutting of the original forest from the 1620s into the 1900s. And around 1870, we introduced a railroad logging throughout the Eastern US, and dramatic decline in forest distribution. And during this time, with all this logging going on, there was a tremendous increase in logging slash that led to the catastrophic fire era. So we had the clear cut era, let's say 1870 to 1920, and then this caused the catastrophic fire era. Now, these are just some early logging pictures that I was able to find. A lot of these are from the Western US, but some are from the Eastern US, just to show you what was going on in the late 1800s throughout this country, basically cutting down all of our old growth forests. So when all that logging was going on, and I guess it started pretty early in Maine, because the Maine fire was 1825, but a lot of these are in this period from 1820 to about 1930, Peshtigo fire, Michigan, Hinckley fire, Minnesota, Wisconsin fire, millions of acres, the Adirondack fire, the Great Idaho fire, which was very famous, and a lot of people lost their lives, 3 million acres, and so forth. But because of these catastrophic fires, this ushered in the Smokey the Bear era, where fires were practically suppressed and went from millions of acres burning every year down to just a few thousand, which is shown here in another paper that Greg Nowacki and I published, showing the catastrophic fire era with over 10 million acres burning. But then Smokey the Bear was legislated during that time, and then this exponential decrease in fire in the East that exists to the present day. And the Smokey the Bear shutdown in burning caused a dramatic change in the Eastern US. At the time of European settlement, you could argue that the Eastern US, despite being a mesic environment, if you will, was really dominated by pyrogenic species. This is the Prairie Peninsula with tall grass prairies and oak savannas and pines, and the vast central hardwoods dominated by oak, and then the oak pine, and then the southern pine, which I talked about before. But we've had about 80 or 90 years of serious fire suppression in the East now, and now we're undergoing this process of mesophication. We are losing our pyrogenic prairie species, savanna species, oak and pine, and this big increase in the red maple, beech, birch, hemlock mix that I have been referring to. And once again, a picture tells 1,000 words. This is another mixed white oak, black oak forest in Pennsylvania, the larger stems, but just surrounded by a sea of very aggressive red maple that's coming in, choking out the oaks. The oaks can't regenerate. And I think you can imagine that in the next 50 or 100 years, when these oaks die off, this will become a red maple dominated forest. So Greg Nowacki and I also published a paper on this concept of mesophication, which has really caught on and people are quite excited about. And what we described in this paper is that prior to 1900, we had a lot of burning. We had open oak and pine forests, fire suppression with Smokey the Bear, closed overstories of oak and pine, which could no longer regenerate very well in the understory. Successional replacement, again, with the maple, beech, birch, hemlock mix coming in, and then into the foreseeable future, losing our oak and pine component and getting this mesophytic type forest replacing it, which is not the way the forest existed at the time of European settlement. So these are kind of unique, novel type of ecosystems, including a lot of invasives. And what is interesting is that even though climate has been warming during this period, mesophication is happening in the face of climate warming, meaning that the suppression of fire is a more important driver of mesophication than warming. In fact, if anything, warming should have promoted oak and pine, but that's not really what is happening. And I will talk about climate before I'm done here. The other problem that I do want to touch upon today, and I've done a little bit of work with this, is that we have very, very high deer populations in most of the eastern US. And when deer get over 20 deer per square mile, this becomes a problem for tree regeneration. So all these yellow, tan, and red areas are problematic with high deer populations. I did have a project with a student, Sarah Johnson, at Valley Forge in southeast Pennsylvania, that have some of the highest deer populations in the eastern US, to the point where there is no woody vegetation at all in the understory. It's dominated by Asian stilt grass. And the only reason that is there because it is toxic to the deer. But all of these trees that are trying to regenerate don't have a chance with these very high deer populations. So I have had some projects with the Nature Conservancy about studying the effects of deer exposure. Also with the Park Service. This is just one example of Mesophication Preserve on Shelter Island on eastern New York, where they put up a nice high deer fence. And you can see outside of the deer fence that the deer can access. They will eat everything. They have very high deer populations. And even within a couple years of fencing this area, we can see an understory returning here by excluding the deer. Now, we did a little bit more than that. I've had projects where we've had the deer fence. We've also thinned out that maple, birch, beech component, just leaving the mixed oak and hickory, white oak, black oak, various hickory species, introducing fire into the understory, and then getting a really good oak regeneration response, particularly after a mast year. If you don't know what a mast year is, that means that periodically these oak and hickory species will have really super high acorn or nut production, maybe every 3, 4, or 5 years. And when those events happen, we get a really good oak regeneration response if given the chance by taking out, opening up the forest, letting light get to the forest understory, getting rid of the undesirable species, putting fire into the forest understory, keeping the deer out. And so we know from these studies what we need to do. Now, doing this over millions of acres is problematic, but at least we have a system now for regenerating our oak and hickory. But what is really interesting about this, and this was another paper that Bryce Hanbury and I did recently, and the point we wanted to make is that even though we have very high deer populations in the east, we also have a densification problem. So ironically, even though we have very high deer, it's not stopping our forests from getting overly dense. But the problem is that the species that are increasing are once again things like the red maple, which are not particularly favorable to the deer. So we're really getting a densification of less desirable species, and we are still not getting our oak and hickory back. So it's not like deer is keeping our forests open. It's not really solving that problem. Our forests are becoming overly dense, even in the face of these high deer numbers, which was the point of that paper. So what can we do to save the eastern oak and pine forests? Well, we can do some logging and thinning to get rid of unwanted and invasive tree species, reduce densification, increase light to the forest understory, try to reintroduce these low to moderate intensity surface fires to prepare a proper seed bed, and then also maintaining low deer populations. So I do want to get towards the end of my talk. I want to leave some time for questions. And just to let you know, because most people don't hear about this, the warming in the eastern US has not been as dramatic as the western US and a lot of other places in the world. We've had significant warming along the northern tier and then the northeast coast, but this very huge area of central hardwoods and then southern oak pine and southern pine have really not warmed dramatically. So a lot of these things that are happening that I'm talking about, like the mesification in this region, is not really climate driven because climate has not changed that much. And so this is really what climate change looks like. And this was a paper, another paper from that Greg and I wrote. You can see that the temperature increases have been really pretty subtle. Even after 1980, which was a big inflection point. Yes, they're kind of, going up a little bit. But the other thing that people don't talk about is even where climate is warming in the eastern US, our precipitation is also increasing. So even where it is warming, this is being buffered by getting more precipitation in the eastern US. So my point is that the eastern US is unique in the world by being a place that has not experienced dramatic warming, and even where it has warmed in the northern tier, that's been coupled with increased precipitation that's buffering the warming effect. In fact, if we look across the entire eastern US and look at some of the dramatic changes, the big increase in shade tolerant species, not due to climate, due to fire suppression, trees invading the savannas and grasslands, fire suppression. There have been some increases in oak and aspen up north from extensive cutting in the northern hardwood forests. We lost our chestnut because of the blight. Beech is declining, at least in the overstory, because of the beech bark disease. Luckily, this is a root sprouting species, so it's not being killed off totally in the same way that the chestnut was, but there is a conversion of large overstory beech to hundreds of small root suckers. So I'm not trying to say climate isn't important, but my research has indicated has not been the primary driver of forest change over the last 100 or 200 years in the eastern US. So most eastern forests had a long history of indigenous burning. Native American depopulation and Smokey the Bear resulted in this loss of fire, and we are now losing our fire-dependent vegetation. Forest densification and mesification is reducing the economic value with more things like black birch and red maple, reducing biodiversity, reducing habitat, reducing mass production for wildlife and other native animal insect species. And this mesification that's going on is actually making our forests more vulnerable to future drought if we get it, and future warming if we get it, because the oak and pine that we had would have been much more resistant to drought and warming. We are losing those species and creating a mix that's going to be more vulnerable if climate change really kicks in the eastern US. So our eastern US forest needs intensive management, including practicing the ways of the early indigenous people. And it's also interesting that there's a lot of articles coming out now in Australia making the same claim, like, wow, we need to start managing our forests the way the Aboriginal people did in Australia. And that's the point that I'm also saying for the eastern US. So I'll end there and be happy to take questions, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mark. This was super cool. Really, really interesting story overall with these forests and looking back in time and seeing how these have really changed over time based on like how different people have like managed them and everything. It's very cool. So
Thank you.
just a reminder to everybody, please, if you have questions, write them in the chat. Write them in the chat, publicly for everybody or directly to me. And then I will be able to read them out loud so that Mark can answer your questions. So while we wait for people to get their questions in, I can kind of kick it off with a question of my own. So I was thinking about this while you were talking, and you kind of addressed a little bit of this, I think, like talked about this, but I was just kind of curious, I suppose. When you were talking about, when you were like reviewing forest composition and really examining these habitats and how they've changed and how they deviate from sort of your expectations, you mentioned that species like hemlock and chestnut that really should have been dominant in these areas were no longer dominant in these areas, and your research, found a link there to differences in like burn history and things like that, among other things. But I was curious if it was like difficult, if it was difficult to sort of separate out the influence of changes in burn regimens from the impact of other causes of their just general decline, like chestnut blight, like woolly adelgid.
Well, that's really a tough question, and in some respects, if I'm understanding your question correctly, it's hard for us to be very definitive about cause and effect, but just using inductive reasoning, that we can document these changes in forests by looking at the witness trees to the modern day surveys, but then, doing our best to try to understand and documenting, well, what were the changes in the fire history at that time? And maybe the best example is going back to that Savage Mountain study, where we were directly able to couple fire history and changes in fire with the changes in composition. And the point that I was trying to make is that during that, let's say, 300-year period where fire was happening, let's say every 8 years, we saw continuous oak recruitment, and we didn't see this maple birch component coming in during that time. But it was really this chestnut blight coupled with Smokey the Bear that really allowed the red maple and birch to really to increase in that site. But you're right. I mean, a lot of times, we're taking the data and doing our best to reconstruct land use history than just using inductive reasoning to try to come up with the best explanations without putting too fine of a point on it.
Right. And, I very much understand that, like, as is the case with pretty much everything in biology, there's not necessarily one singular variable that explains, something that we see. A lot of the time we have multiple different variables that are working together to create a result that we're observing. In this case, the current forest composition of different species in one area. And it's just a matter of figuring out like how much influence one thing has compared to another variable and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just find it to be a very interesting system to be working in overall, and I imagine it does pose some kind of challenge when you guys are working on that and trying to disentangle these.
Yeah, because you really can't do it really as a controlled experiment, in a lab or a greenhouse. We're working, with these huge natural systems, but really, trying to consider all the different factors and really keeping an open mind about it. I mean, I would have been perfectly happy early in my career to say all this was due to climate, but I just never came up with climate as an answer for these things. So
the data doesn't necessarily say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally understand. We have a few questions in the chat. Let me read some of those off. So first up, we have a nice comment. Excellent, thank you. I'll use your new paper in class.
Oh, great.
Okay, so we have, excuse me, one comment says, In Australia and Western North America, there are still indigenous people who retain memory of some of the details of how the landscape was managed for millennia. Have you found native sources in the East who have retained that knowledge?
Um, Boy, that's really an excellent question. That's getting into the oral history by the native people. Um, and I've read some of that work. I mean, not that much of it is published and not that much of it is available to me. I had one project with the Menominee tribe in northern Wisconsin where I was directly working with native people on these topics and doing fire history and so forth. But I am working with a Native American woman in the Dene or Navajo tribe in the Four Corners region. And her specialty is oral history. But it is very interesting because out west, the climate people are really dominating the thinking of what drives fire and what drives vegetation out there. But very recently, there's been some really excellent studies that are starting to recognize the oral history of the native people in the Four Corners region and their use of fire and agriculture. And that also had a profound effect on the ecosystems out there. So I guess what I'm trying to say, out west, it'd be very easy for climate to take over the thinking of people. And in fact, it really has. And something like, 90+% of the fire papers I read out there all talked about being driven by climate. Recently, these big catastrophic fires, and that the native people played no role out there. But now that pendulum is starting to shift out there. And what I'm saying is that they are now recognizing the important role that natives played even in the Four Corners region. But I will say that early on, there were some really excellent papers about California oak and Native American burning. So a very similar story on both coasts there with the burning and oak.
This reminds me of a talk that I listened to a while back by Robin Kimmerer, talking about sort of how the the colonizing societies have tended to through Western scientific method principles have kind of rediscovered things that were learned ages ago by Native Americans that they could have just asked.
Yeah, right.
And I find that all very interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and unfortunately, as I said, a lot of this oral history that's known at the local level has not been published, is not available to scientists like me.
Yeah.
So we have to make the effort to actually seek out these native tribes and so forth.
Yeah. Oh. A few more questions. How do you imagine, excuse me, how do you imagine contemporary forest composition would differ if there had never been human colonization of the Northeast United States?
Well, the Northeast is interesting because there's what's called a tension zone there, and the northern part of New England is dominated by northern hardwood, hemlock type forests, but then southern New England is dominated mostly by oak and pine. And I guess the question is and we think that this is because of human burning southern New England and along the coast, actually all the way up to Maine, promoting oak and pine types. So the question is, would northern hardwoods have dominated all of New England without Native Americans? I guess the answer to that would probably be yes, because we know by suppressing fire in southern New England, there's been a dramatic increase in this red maple and birch type. So I think it's fair to say that oak and pine in southern New England, coastal New England, was due to Native American burning. And without that, we're seeing these forests change. Now, on some of the really rough, sandy coastal soils, that's going to be what's called an edaphic climax of oak and pine, pitch pine, scrub oak. That's probably not going to go anywhere, seems to burn intensively, maybe through occasional lightning caused fires. So there is this concept of edaphic climax on really coarse sandy soils, but on better quality soils, those northern hardwoods probably would have dominated throughout southern New England.
Another question. Did you notice any difference in growth of chestnut, excuse me, chestnut species, of chestnut species regeneration from root sprouts in the study sites of oak pine versus red maple birch sites?
Well, we know that chestnut is persisting at a very low level through root sprouts. But I'm sorry, did the person ask about the growth of those sprouts?
They asked, sorry, let me read it again. Did you notice any difference in growth of the chestnut species regeneration from root sprouts in the study sites of oak pine versus red maple birch sites?
Well, chestnut would not have been that common in the northern hardwood type, and it is more associated with the mixed oak type, if that's any help at all. Yeah, I'm kind of struggling because I really haven't studied that directly.
Okay, we have a clarifying comment here or question here. They also asked, were they any more robust in any particular sites, the chestnut?
Yeah, and I would refer you to a paper by Emily Russell that was published in Torrey probably about 30 years ago that actually, and actually I wasn't on this, but Greg Nowacki, I think, did another chestnut paper also about where the chestnut was in the original forest. But there was an oak chestnut type, if you will. And I know that chestnut doesn't like limestone soil, so it's going to be not on the valley floors as much as it's going to be on the ridges, but much more associated with the oak type than the northern hardwood type.
Okay, great. I have another question. So I found your deer exclusion experiments to be really interesting, and you know, obviously there's you know, some pretty impactful results that come out of that indicate, you know, maybe we're managing deer perhaps incorrectly in these locations and that may need to change. I was curious if you had any thoughts on how that might play with like the powers at be for like how we sort of manage deer, like, you know, the fact that we manage deer primarily by allowing people to hunt them and you know, things like that, and you know, maybe some of that versus like the concept of perhaps returning some of their native predators to some of these Midwestern and Eastern habitats. Curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, people have very strong opinions on that. And, you know, some people are very much against killing deer in any type of form. But those people, and I certainly understand that, but, you know, they have to understand that there's a big price that we pay for allowing unchecked deer populations in terms of what it does to agriculture and what it does to forestry. So you can't have, you know, wonderful agriculture and, you know, all of forest regenerating and all the deer in the world. You know, you have to give up something. And I personally would rather see lower deer populations, because all estimates is that they're much higher now than they were, you know, prior to European settlement. So realize that they're sort of out of control. I certainly understand the people that are against hunting them and killing them in any form.
Yeah, I think that you know, that thought process is not uncommon. Um, I was curious. I guess so. You would, from your results, I imagine you would, if you were asked to make a recommendation to like the like Fish and Wildlife, it would probably be along the lines of increase the number of licenses for deer hunting in these specific areas. Is that
Yeah, particularly living in Pennsylvania for the last 35 years. I'd be shot if I said otherwise, but yeah, I would not be against that, because I realize that deer populations are unusually high. So that's kind of the logic behind it, but there's actually fewer and fewer hunters every year. So
Is that right?
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, society has been changing dramatically, and there's
I didn't realize that. So perhaps for
many fewer people are interested in hunting. It's the whole urbanization thing and so forth.
wow, boy, that's another layer of complication I hadn't really considered. Wow, very interesting.
Yeah. So maybe sterilization and those type of things.
Yeah, some other mechanism.
But there are people that have dedicated their whole career to this topic, and I'm only kind of working on it peripherally with excluding deer and seeing how the forests react to it,
Right.
which is positive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, super interesting. We don't have any more questions in the chat, so I think that we are probably good to wrap up. So thank you so much, Mark, for coming and speaking to us today. We really loved having you. This research that you presented was super interesting, and of course your paper in our special issue is fantastic, and I encourage everybody to go check it out.
Thanks again for the invite. I didn't mention when I was growing up, my grandmother lived in the Bronx, and my father would always take me to the botanical garden and the Bronx Zoo and so forth. So I have a long history there.
That's awesome.
All right,
yes.
take care.
Yeah, take care, everybody.